if that might not be a way that we're going to evolve in neurofeedback from the system of under-arousal, over-arousal, and instabilities to something like Damasio and Parsons and Merker's concept of the deep layer of proto-self to the next layer up is core self, which the psychodynamic people for 100 years called object relations. How do we interact with someone in our environment who changes us and we change them? So you move from proto-self to core self up to an autobiographical self, which is the story of yourself that becomes coherent over time. And these are 3 layers of self. And then what Jung was talking about, a century ago, was that there's an archetypal self, which, Alcaro and Corrigan have pointed out in one of Jung's early writings. Jung said, this has to exist at the level of the brainstem. And so are we actually going to be thinking about neurofeedback in terms of those levels of self and consciousness? And when I listen to some of the work that Ruth Lanius has done, showing the underdevelopment of the midline structures of the brain that we would call the default mode network, and how they're underdevelopment in people with developmental trauma. And what we're trying to do, she and Nicholson and others have shown how if you use a certain process of neurofeedback, alpha down training, you can restore that connectivity that seems to be missing in the traumatized people, and you're actually creating a more coherent self.
Our guest today is Alex N. Sabo, MD, a 500-hour Kripalu Yoga Teacher and magna cum laude graduate of Harvard College. He's currently senior faculty member engaged in teaching psychiatric residents and medical students studying at the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Berkshire Medical Center. He's also an Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Massachusetts Chan Medical School. He's past president of the Massachusetts Psychiatric Society, a distinguished life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, and has authored, edited, and co-authored many important works, including The Real-World Guide to Psychotherapy Practice. He enjoys practicing and teaching yoga, meditation, teaching medical students and residents, hiking, swimming, bicycling, playing pickleball, paddleboarding, and spending time with his family. Alex, thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion. I wonder if you could start out by talking about when neurofeedback comes up in conversation, for people who don't, know what it is. How do you describe it to them?
I describe it in various ways depending on who I'm speaking with, but most simply, I would say that the brain likes to function in efficient ways, and there's an electrical signal generated by the neurons in the brain that we can pick up at the skull surface, and through various engineering techniques, we can break that electrical signal, the EEG, the raw EEG, down into filtered wave bands. And those filtered wave bands correspond to different states of mind, and we can train the brain using feedback to more efficiently create certain wavelengths of electrical activity. And I think that effort roughly corresponds to the kinds of things that high-level professional athletes or musicians learn over time through practice. Yogis learn that, meditation experts learn that, how to quiet parts of the brain and allow other parts of the brain to fire electrical activity more efficiently. So we can teach the brain to do that with help through various methods. One is to train like a professional athlete or a musician, to train like a yogi or a meditator, expert meditator. But we can also train the brain using neurofeedback to optimize its performance. So that would be my, and I would say that would be the first way I would explain it. And usually you engage the other person by saying, if you could optimize the way your brain functions, what would you like it to be able to do? And there are very few people who don't have some idea about that readily catches their imagination. And after we have that part of the conversation, I would say that in some ways, neurofeedback experts have used a model of an over-aroused brain, an under-aroused brain, or brain with some instabilities, creating things like migraine headaches or swings of mood that are intense. And so we also screen for those to try to begin to put together a profile of what we might be able to do to help a person who wants to optimize his or her brain functioning. So that would be the first way to explain it.
That's great. Thank you. And can you tell the story of how you were working at Berkshire's Medical Center, and how did you find out about neurofeedback? How did you hear about it? How did you get introduced?
Yeah, well, I'm going to start that story by telling a little bit about my background and then how the neurofeedback plays into that. So I had trained earlier in my career. I'd done a fellowship in psychodynamic psychiatry at the Austin Riggs Center. I had trained at Harvard prior to that. I had been a clinical director at McLean Hospital. And so I was trained in both psychodynamic psychiatry and also in biologic psychiatry. And for a large part of my career, I've been a psychiatrist for almost 40 years now. I've used a pharmacologic approach and a psychodynamic approach to helping people. And for almost 30 years, I was chair of the Department of Psychiatry at the Berkshire Medical Center. And about 15 years ago, I started a residency training program in psychiatry. And so I trained young physicians to become psychiatrists. As part of that whole effort, I also did some research with people at Kripalu on yoga and meditation, and I became a 500-hour trained Kripalu Yoga meditation teacher. And so I had this background of interest, you might say, in how do you make unconscious material conscious? And when one of my psychopharmacology teachers moved out to the Berkshires just before the pandemic, he contacted me, and he happened to be a trauma expert, Bessel van der Kolk. And when he contacted me, he said, how could, fate has brought us together again. How can we play together some way? And so we talked about different things, and I introduced him to my department, the faculty, the residents, and he was very interested in neurofeedback as an untapped modality that really has a better place in helping people, particularly with trauma. And so we kind of went down that pathway, and he brought my group in contact with a number of experts from around the world and the country. So we trained up a little bit with Yuri Kropotov coming out of St. Petersburg before the troubles of the recent events took place. So Yuri taught us. Bessel taught us, Ruth taught us, Fisher has done a lot of work with us as a mentor in weekly supervision. Frank Corrigan has taught us, Mitchell and Joey Gassadar, Linda Walker, Ed Hamlin. So we've had some really top-notch educators teach us and share ideas with us. And it's been a really interesting process for me because I'm sort of winding down my career, but I'm still teaching young physicians to become psychiatrists. And so I'm kind of trying to look at what's available now that I didn't have available to me when I was their age. And I really wish I was starting all over again right now, particularly with neurofeedback and with deep brain reorienting, because they are two tools that I did not have for the majority of my career that I would love to make sure this new generation of psychiatrists has. And that's kind of a long-winded version of it. I would say that I asked Yuri Kropotov when he was first teaching us about the equations to translate the electrical activity into the brain, into various oscillations. Why did these oscillations develop in these frequencies? Like, in my life, I would say now that what I've been trying to do for a lifetime was translate theta into alpha awareness as I would catch dreams or creative ideas from the unconscious that were just preconscious. And I was trying to cultivate techniques to do that without using neurofeedback, but using other techniques, dream interpretation, yoga, meditation, and then neurofeedback helps me with that process. So I was trying to figure that out, and I asked him, why did these oscillations develop? And he said, it was millions of years of evolution of the neurons of the brain trying to find the most efficient way to function. And that's given us the basic bandwidths that we seem to study, our delta, our theta, our alpha, our low beta, high beta, gamma. And he said, in the East, there were kind of explorers of consciousness who learned through yoga and meditation to experience these things. But in the West, we're a much more impatient and technologically minded people, and we've developed neurofeedback. And so, listening to him, I was thinking, I've been on that path, and as a Western trained, scientist physician, I developed along one path, but I was always trying to bring dream material into consciousness in my own personal life and to some extent with my patients. And so I learned more about a slightly different tool, yoga and meditation and types of meditation. And then when I saw neurofeedback, I thought, wow, this is a great tool to help me on this quest. And then more recently, I've been introduced to Frank Corrigan and his work through Fisher and through Ruth Lanier's. And, Frank Corrigan's, forays down into the proto-self are very much like the yogis' explorations down into, some of the deeper levels of consciousness that they've developed methods to explore. So this is kind of where I'm at right now. And I've been teaching the residents, most recently, the residents are training how to understand what Frank Corrigan and Ruth Lanius are revealing to us through deep brain reorienting psychotherapy, and how we can use that to help a lot of our patients who've been called refractory to treatment, we don't have a method to help them get out of repetitive patterns of behavior or suffering that they're in.
Yeah, that's great. And so it sounds like you were already, when you're talking about the exploration to find, how does the unconscious become conscious and how can we stimulate that process? You were already engaged in an exploration of these kinds of topics as you discovered neurofeedback and deep brain reorienting. I wonder if you could talk about how, because I think for a lot of folks, like just hearing the initial parts about what the oscillatory nature of the nervous system and what deep brain reorienting is doing in terms of addressing the PAG and the, all the other brainstem parts. I think it's very intimidating. I wonder if you can break that down for folks. Like what is that? How do you think of that? How do you think about those things?
Sure. So I would think of it in a number of different paradigms, but the way that Frank Corrigan and Ruth Linus are describing it is that we want to be able to access material that's being understood by the brainstem, or maybe another way to predate the work they've done is that for a long time, neuroscientists, psychiatrists, neurologists have talked about the brain and that there's sort of a reticular activating system at its base that's mostly reptilian. And then as we progress up through the brainstem to the midbrain, we get into sort of mammalian systems, and layered on top of that are higher mammal, primate, and human systems that really give us a multi-layered brain which replicates evolution. And Paul MacLean wrote about this, the triune mammalian brain, back in the 50s and 60s. Carl Sagan made this very popular in his book, The Dragons of Eden, written, I think, in the 70s. And so this concept of the layered human brain was present for a long time. And, Carl Jung had talked about the archetypal unconscious, or the unconscious that's inherited, that's beneath a personal unconscious of your life, and that can be revealed through methods like painting and art and poetry and through dream exploration, and that it's present in all cultures throughout history. So there are different aspects of this undertaking that have been understood for a long time, but probably in the last 20 years or so, there are a number of scientists, Bjorn Merker, Panksepp, who've explored the idea that at a very fundamental level, the brainstem itself makes decisions, and decisions toward action, so that if neuroscience is now better capable of exploring consciousness, we can understand consciousness as kind of coming to life with a sense of self, like who am I, what am I, and Panksepp talks about a trans-species self, or an organism that's embodied with a kind of consciousness to be able to take action out in the world, be changed by the environment, and react to it. And that level of the self is probably a brainstem. Merker talks about it as a superior colliculus self. Frank Corrigan has designed his clinical therapies, based on these concepts, and he's currently exploring them with fMRI research and randomized trials with Ruth Lanius. So, your question was about how do I understand these things in relation to the work I've been doing, I think, prior to this last wave of research and really exciting development that I think Ruth is doing and Frank Corrigan's doing. I think Bessel really opened the doors to this with that famous book that he wrote, The Body Keeps the Score. And Bessel said regularly, the story that people tell about trauma is not the trauma. The trauma is something different that's held in the body and remembered there. And that's very much what Frank Corrigan's deep brain reorienting is about. How can we get to this level of the brain at the superior colliculus that controls the visual fields and the ability to move and orient our face towards our way from another or from something in the environment? How can we use that core perceptual and motor process to find an anchor in traumatic experiences and open the file of trauma so that you can safely process it with a person in a very manageable way? And this represents a tremendous revolution in neuroscience, psychotherapy, psychiatry, opportunities for healing. And I'm just struck by the kind of brilliance of the people who've contributed to this moment of awareness that we're in right now. And it's just the beginning of a revolution in what we can do to help people. And it couldn't come too soon because we have a super highly traumatized population right now, nationally, globally, and that's evidenced by suicide rates going up, by the opioid overdose mortality, by the type of intolerance and the sort of polarizing of viewpoints leading to violence against groups that are considered by one group to be an out group and not part of their in group. And we're in a very dangerous moment, both collectively and individually. And so anything we can do to optimize our ability to help people who are traumatized and are responding to the environment in various maladaptive ways, anything we can do to help them is really needed. So I feel like we're at a very exciting moment where new knowledge is coming to bear, and we're also at a very dangerous moment, both collectively and individually, in terms of our own mental health and well-being.
That's great. Thank you. Part of what I find inspiring about this way of this paradigm, this story about the brain and how people respond to it, is implied there that the behavioral, the dysregulation, the behavioral changes that people go through is a response to either chemical or behavioral, circumstances, and that the actual the process of the therapeutic process in neurofeedback and deep brain reorienting is finally about empowering the person to be able to make those changes themselves. I wonder if you could talk about what that looks like, this sense of saying, because I think the part that I think has been traditionally left out is this idea that that the responses that people are making to circumstances or to chemical, sort of what the world looks like to them, that those are just the healthy responses of their system. So that sort of what we're talking about here is not that the system is broken, but that it's not functioning as optimally as it could be in these circumstances. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Sure. And one way I would kind of link what you're saying to trends in psychiatry would go like this. I recently had Roger McIntyre, who's one of the leaders in the world on the concept and the treatment of refractory depression. I had him come to give a grand rounds, and he showed me a paper that's about to be published in World Psychiatry, about what is treatment refractory depression and what are our opportunities for improving the care of people who have it. And one of the things, there's a couple paragraphs in the paper that mentions this statistic. If you've had trauma, and they use that age range 4 to 7 years old, if you've had emotional trauma or developmental trauma at 4 to 7 years old, you have only a 15% chance of getting remission from treatment with an antidepressant, our best antidepressants, after an 8-week trial. Okay. If you haven't had developmental trauma, you have an 85% chance of responding. Well, I think that that's a pure biologic psychiatry pharmacology perspective, but taking that fact into perspective means we've got to identify the people who are at risk for non-response from the people who may respond well. And when we do that, what are we going to offer the people who are at risk for only a 15% response? These are people who have depression. They're not identified as having PTSD or early developmental trauma, but they're often identified as having refractory depression, chronic pain syndromes that their primary care doctors can't figure out, severe generalized anxiety disorder, self-medication with opioids or alcohol, and how are we going to help those people? So the empowerment that you're talking about is, how do we read with people and try to understand the suffering that they have and offer the best scientific models that we have to understanding what might be driving their experience? So the way I would talk with people, I just did a session this morning before our podcast with a person who has had, chronic severe pain, severe refractory depression, severe, global anxiety disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder, and she hasn't responded to pharmacologic interventions. And she has anger spells where she blows up at people at certain types of triggers and then isolates herself for a while to try to recover and then come back. And I talked to her today about, the idea behind deep brain reorienting, where we process information when we notice a threat by orienting to a potential threat. And then attention develops, and then perhaps a shock at the threat. Some pain may develop related to that. And then emotional reacting and thoughts are farther along in that processing. So if she were willing to kind of explore with me a recent event in her life where one of these triggers of anger and fury occurred, we could break that down into manageable pieces of experience for her, where she could notice an orienting tension in her neck or forehead around her eyes. We'd slow the whole thing down. so that it didn't traumatize her, re-traumatize her, but she would begin to be able to come into her body where the memory, not just of this event occurs, but there are probably memories from much earlier events that have sort of triggered a pattern of reacting, which she feels really stuck in. So the deep brain reorienting allows me to enter into a mutual exploration with her of what can give her more freedom in her life. We're going to find a way to freedom without re-traumatizing her, and it's based on the way the brain processes information, first at the level of the superior colliculus, or what Frank Corrigan calls the where self, where you know where you are oriented in space and time. And we enter there at that moment, that pivot of awareness, sort of a brainstem level of consciousness. And what I'm thinking right now is that through yoga and meditation and through studying what Frank and Ruth are talking about, I'm sort of moving myself up and down that axis of cortex through limbic system to brainstem to, proto-self, the embodied, incarnate form of a mammal, and then practicing moving back up, flowing up and down through that process myself, so that when I'm working with a patient, I can help him or her explore that more efficiently in his or her own experience of both consciousness and body. And I was thinking this morning when I woke up, I was thinking about our podcast that, I actually wonder if that might not be a way that we're going to evolve in neurofeedback from the system of under-arousal, over-arousal, and instabilities to something like DiMaggio and Panksepp's, the Merker's concept of the deep layer of proto-self to the next layer up is core self, which the psychodynamic people for 100 years called object relations. How do we interact with someone in our environment who changes us and we change them? So you move from proto-self to core self up to an autobiographical self, which is the story of yourself that becomes coherent over time. And these are 3 layers of self. And then what Jung was talking about, a century ago, was that there's an archetypal self, which, Alcaro and Corrigan have pointed out in one of Jung's early writings. Jung said, this has to exist at the level of the brainstem. And so are we actually going to be thinking about neurofeedback in terms of those levels of self and consciousness? And when I listen to some of the work that Ruth Lanius has done, showing the underdevelopment of the midline structures of the brain that we would call the default mode network, and how they're underdevelopment of people with developmental trauma. And what we're trying to do, she and Nicholson and others have shown how it's you use a certain process of neurofeedback, alpha down training, you can restore that connectivity that seems to be missing in the traumatized people, and you're actually creating a more coherent self. And if you study some of the literature about advanced meditators, you actually see almost the opposite thing happening, that there's deep increased connectivity in those core structures for accomplished meditators. And you might think of that, in my yoga and meditation training, I was trained in two types of yoga meditation. One form was householder yoga and meditation. And so householder yoga and meditation is meant for me as a psychiatrist with a family and who goes to his job and takes care of his patients. And I want to learn how to calm my brain, focus my awareness, keep my boundaries, keep my boundaries. That's for householders. That's one type. Then I've done another type of advanced meditation and yoga practice, which actually wants to dissolve my sense of self. So that goes back to Stanislav Grof and Kubler-Ross and sort of the early pioneers in transpersonal psychology, where they were trying to explore ego states where the self dissolved in a therapeutic way. And when do you want to dissolve the self, and when do you want to strengthen it? And so how do you understand the neuroscience that evolved from the time Stanislav Grof and Kubler-Ross were exploring that, and when they got into troubles with, psychedelics and the abolition of all that for a number of years. And now we're coming back to again saying we've got to understand the way the self evolves and strengthens. And then when do we want to dissolve it because it's too rigid and too, and we have other tasks at hand, And that kind of roughly corresponds with the stage of life I'm at, that earlier in life, I needed to develop a sense of identity and professional self and clarity, a good householder yoga type person. And now I'm heading more towards my transition into the next phase, what the Buddhists would call my continuation or the end of this manifestation, and I've got to be ready to dissolve myself and my attachments. And so how does neurofeedback help us with that? How does deep brain reorienting help us with that and form a kind of sensible, health-based approach and a brain-based approach to helping people? So that's kind of what I'm thinking about,
That's great. That's really lots of interesting stuff there. We could spend some time just talking about just what you covered right there. But I also want to keep one of the there are themes that are kind of going through a lot of these conversations that I'm having. And one of the things that comes up, partly because it's what I find interesting, having gone through therapy many times before actually coming to work with Eager, and recognizing after a point that almost everyone who works in this community, who has been working in this area, there's a sense of the sort of prioritization of that therapeutic relationship, what they call the therapeutic alliance, and how important that is. And I was just thinking in the context of what you were just talking about, this idea of really a therapist being the guide of helping someone to understand how should I think of myself and what kind of work is going on there. So I wonder if you could talk about the importance of, because, people come to, especially to neurofeedback, from a very technological, especially in this country, right? An extremely we hook you up and we do a cue and then boom, we're good. And, obviously from people like Seaburn Fisher and Frank Corrigan, part of what they're bringing to it is this real, there's a kind of evolved sense of self that they actually bring to the therapeutic process.
Right.
I wonder if you could talk about what that
Sure.
for folks who are entering into the field.
Yeah, I would really emphasize exactly what you're talking about, Lars, that we're always entering a field with each other. we're creating a mind between us, meaning when you and I are talking today, we are creating a shared mind. So you're affecting my brain, I'm affecting your brain. When we go to sleep tonight, whatever was new that took place in our shared mind in the work between us, the conversation between us, is going to be recorded. Our hippocampus is going to be working to replace all kinds of cortical association areas and build synapses in areas where we have new connections, and maybe dissolve some of the old ones where the model that we had before we met each other today to talk existed. So each day we're revising our maps, and we're using the neuroplasticity of our brains and the various ways that neuroplasticity is achieved to change our brains. So right now, when you and I have talked, and you and I have gotten to know each other over the past year or so, I've been changing your brain, and you've been changing my brain. We've been changing neural circuits, and the same things happening between Seabird and me, and Frank Corrigan and me, and Ruth Moanians and me. And we're changing each other's brains in these conversations. And it's because we're creating a shared mind. And it's exactly the way I would explain things to a patient who's interested in maybe hearing about that. And at minimum, I would be saying to the patient, it's so important for me to understand your map of the world for me to be able to help you. So when I try to repeat back to you something that I've heard about how you're thinking or feeling or experiencing something, I love it when you correct me with a counter brushstroke in a shared tapestry we're painting together, because that's how I learn, and you're changing me, and I'm helping change you in a way that you asked me to help you. So the relational aspect of this is essential, and particularly with neurofeedback, if you think about being a good psychopharmacologist, you have your theories and how certain medicines work, but you always know that when you're with an individual person, that person is going to have their own response to whatever you do together. So that person is your co-investigator. They're your co-researcher on figuring out what works. And I think Hebron, and the way she teaches neurofeedback, is very fundamentally a person who's engaging in a co-exploration with their client, to figure out what does the client want to work on, and how are they going to explore a site and a frequency and optimize what the client can get from that particular site and various frequencies that are explored. And she does that in an extremely respectful way. And it's a mutual exploration based on the idea that we're coming together to create a shared mind, and your brain is going to be changed, or my brain's going to be changed. And that's just what happens, So that's what I would think about that relational aspect of this.
That's really great. Yeah. And I wonder if you could share just some thoughts about what you see happening in the next 5 or 10 years with respect to how people, just because you've worked, in professional capacity for many years in the institutions that provide healthcare for folks, I think you're in a unique place to kind of have some, from the vista where you are, what does it look like for the next 5 or 10 years, the way that healthcare and mental healthcare in particular is going to be shifting?
Well, I think, there's a tremendous need. There's just an overwhelming need for good mental health care and wellness practices in the area of mental health. And And so there's a huge need, but how are we going to effectively address that need? And I think that with respect to what we're talking about today, I think deep brain reorienting is a very powerful intervention that could be taught regularly and used. Behind it, we haven't really figured out who is going to get well enough and functional enough from DBR, who's going to be the responders and what sort of amount of DBR will help them, and who would benefit more from neurofeedback in addition to DBR or neurofeedback in addition to other modalities of treatment. The tricky part about the two, from my perspective, with working within a hospital setting and an educational setting, is that within a hospital setting or an educational setting, you have to have methods that are considered efficient, that have a business plan behind them that seems to be able to generate a profit, that there can't be too much time for training and exploration that's non-reimbursed, because those systems will get overwhelmed financially if there's a long learning curve. So with neurofeedback, what I've seen so far is that there are many different types of neurofeedback you could do. You could do the sort of band training type that I've been doing with CBERN, and that you could be doing QEEG type treatments. You could do infralow. There are a lot of different ways you could do it, and you'd have to figure out where are we going to invest our training and our money to do that. The FDA recently approved this PRISM system that Gray Matter Health is bringing out, and that was based on some University of Tel Aviv University neuroscientists who had found a way to get an fMRI-guided EEG signature for training the amygdala to downregulate. And so that's a particularly important moment, because a system got approved to do a very specific task of teaching the amygdala to do something, and they overcame the scalability problem by using an expensive fMRI research method to show there's a correlated EEG signature that could be picked up using more traditional neurofeedback equipment. And so that's a very cool thing that happened. And that's going to, already one of the residents who trained with us went on to a very prestigious university, and 2 weeks ago convinced the chair of their neuromodulation committee, of their neuromodulation department, to add neurofeedback to what they had considered neuromodulation, deep brain stimulation, transcranial magnetic stimulation. But the coalescence of the approval based on the work at Tel Aviv University and at NYU Langone with the FDA helped this resident who trained with us in neurofeedback convince them to go ahead. So I think the more enlightened and financially powerful organizations are going to pick this up quickly. NYU Langone, this particular hospital that I'm mentioning, also very prestigious. And that's going to be one set of movements. I think from the scalability problem, it's much easier to teach DBR and teach the neuroscience behind DBR without having to have a lot of functioning software EEG systems. So that's an easier load to start with. What can we do here? And what do we want to do beyond that DBR needs help with?
Yeah.
And I think that's what 𝙉𝙬𝙪's been interested in, is what's the combination of the two that we should put together? And I'm interested in trying to teach neuroscience from the point of view of experiential neuroscience as how does consciousness emerge, and what is the self? What's the self at an animal level? What's the self as we transition into a human sense of consciousness, and the neuroscience around that? And I think it's not like a far-off exploration. It's a very central exploration to who needs to build the self and who needs to dissolve the self, and when do you need to build it and strengthen it, and when would you be better off loosening it and making it more flexible and adaptable. And I think we can teach that as a basic form of human development and neuroscience development. And I'm also interested if it becomes actually a way to think about what we do in neurofeedback. And example, I'm going to go down to kind of study with Ed Hamlin and Mary Ammerman at their intro to deep states and alpha theta, because I think that will help me with this thing I've been wondering about. 𝙉𝙬𝙪 did some, before I was going to have some surgery, she did an alpha theta session with me, which was quite lovely to sort of as a gift before I went into surgery. And what I found was that the alpha theta allowed me to access a kind of, you might call it a psychedelic-like experience that only came from my deeper states of liberation yoga meditation, not my householder yoga meditation practice, and certain kind of, experiential sort of components that I learned to activate in the yoga meditation practice could get activated in the alpha theta. And so that's a very cool thing to me, because that is moving into transpersonal psychology and not the building of the self that Ruth Lanius and Frank are talking about. So those are some of the things I'm thinking about.
Great. Yeah, this is wonderful. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me a little bit today about all these things.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Thank you for inviting me. And I think we're in an exciting time in neuroscience and mental health history, neurofeedback, DBR. It's a very cool time.
Thanks for watching. If you found something helpful, use a like and subscribe. It helps us with YouTube algorithm and lets us know we're on the right track.